Uhuru Kenyatta is declared president again. But across Kenya, protests and violence continue. Has the government's legitimacy been shaken? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Kenya's election crisis. It was supposed to be different this time, but Kenya's presidential election rerun had an all too familiar feel. The incumbent president, Uhuru Kenyatta, secured the most votes, but opposition leader Raila Odinga, who boycotted the poll, called the entire election a sham. He now wants to hold yet another vote. There have been demonstrations and violence leading to deaths and injuries. Many registered voters didn't even go to the polls. Some feared for their own safety, some were apathetic, while many others faced the outright closure of their polling stations over security concerns. So what's next for Kenya? Shoaib Hassan takes a look.
A troubled country sliding deeper into crisis. This is what Kenya has become after an opposition-led boycott of presidential elections. Odinga's warning was aimed at his opponent, the incumbent president. Uhuru Kenyatta defeated Odinga in the original election back in August, but Odinga's NASA party successfully challenged the result in the country's Supreme Court. The court annulled the results and ordered a rerun on October the 26th. But the instability due to continued protests cut economic growth from 5.7% in 2016 to 2.3% so far this year, and the violence has claimed 51 lives since August. It's pretty much a clan war. President Kenyatta belongs to the country's largest Kikuyu tribe, while Odinga is from the Luo. Their rivalry goes back generations, but many believe it has no place in the present.
Let them come together and sit and discuss the future of our nation. Because we want a Kenya where leaders come and go. We want a country where we can live for our children's children.
Despite the turmoil, neither side is willing to back down, and Odinga's party says it's certain to once again challenge the election results as Kenya's future continues to be uncertain. Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
And to discuss Kenya's rerun election further, I'm joined now from Nairobi by Kimani Ichung'wah. He is a member of parliament for the Kikuyu constituency. Also from Nairobi, Dennis Owino. He is the founder of the news blog Kenya Insights. And from Johannesburg, Aisha Kaji. She is a political analyst and the former program director of the International Human Rights Program at the University of Witwatersrand. Thanks all so much for joining us. Is it fair, Aisha, as an analyst, I'm going to start with you, is it fair for the election board to declare a winner? Doesn't this just leave Kenyans exactly where they were before the Supreme Court made its landmark ruling?
Absolutely. It leaves Kenyans in the same position they were after the outcome of the August election, given that Mr. Odinga didn't participate in this election, and also given that many of the reforms that were recommended to be made before this rerun were not actually made, and that there are reports, widespread reports, of both electoral officials and judges and other members of the criminal justice system being intimidated in the run-up to this recount. Okay, then let me ask Kimani, do you think Aisha has made a fair assessment there?
You know, Aisha's assessment is very far from the reality on the ground. I can tell you there has been absolutely no intimidation on any member of the Electoral Commission or the judiciary for that matter. Number two, she talks about reforms that were recommended. And I want to tell Aisha there were no reforms that were recommended by the court. The court just made a simple ruling that there were illegalities and irregularities that was up to the Electoral Commission to fix. And they did stipulate what they had done to fix those problems. what she's calling recommendations were demands by one of the political parties that was Mr. Odinga's political party and the coalition he led. Reforms that they wanted to be done before they could go into elections. And many of those reforms were done. The ones that could not be done are those things that were absurd and practically impossible to do within the timelines that were there, the 60 days that were put by the Supreme Court. Therefore, what has happened is that we, as a country, have stood by the rule of law, we have stood by our constitution, and we are abiding, the IEBC, the Electoral Commission, is abiding by the ruling from the Supreme Court that they had to hold elections within 60 days in line with the constitution and our laws, our electoral laws. And I think that has been done. The fact that Mr. Odinga decided to boycott this election is a vindication of our position before, that he knew he was going to lose in this election, and he could not in any way garner the numbers that needed him to win in this election. And there is nothing that illegitimizes this election because Mr. Odinga decided to boycott. What would be illegitimate in this election is if we did not abide by our constitution and our electoral laws.
But Kimani, I mean,
why then did an electoral...
Okay, go ahead, Ayesha.
Sorry, why then did an Electoral Commission official flee to the United States just days before the election? Why were there reports that judges who were due to rule on whether the elections should go ahead were actually placed under house arrest, according to my sources on the ground, in Nairobi, in the run-up to the election? So if you say that this election hasn't been delegitimized, why is the major opposition leader, why has he boycotted this election? Why was the turnout so poor when Kenyans generally are very, very eager to vote in elections?
You know, Aisha, when you say that electoral officials had to get away to the United States, is only one commissioner, a commissioner who had her own issues because she was working for and with the opposition political party. She, you remember, Mr. Odinga before the elections did assert that he had very credible sources within the commission, and it's therefore clear who this commissioner or who these electoral officers were who are working with Mr. Odinga. And let me say it has been a very well choreographed attempt to sabotage the elections, right from the purported withdrawal of Mr. Odinga from the election without filling the requisite statutory forms, to the purported resignation and what was a stage-managed escape from this country by one of those commissioners who was working with them, was part of the wider scheme to try and derail these elections. The chair of the Electoral Commission was also being put under pressure by the same forces to scuttle the election. Therefore, when Aisha also talks about judicial officers being put under house arrest, you know, it's absurd. Nobody from the Chief Justice to the 7 Supreme Court judges, every other Supreme Court judge who was not in court on Wednesday did give reasons. One of them is in hospital sick. He's been sick from the last court judgment. All the other judges some were out of the country. Remember the day that case was to come up on a public holiday. It was a public holiday.
Okay, Dennis, as a Raila Odinga supporter, I'd like to ask you what you make of the comments you've heard on both sides of this issue so far.
Well, as for Mr. Ichunga, I wasn't expecting any other thing other than defending the system. First of all, he's very economical with the truth. The fact that happened and everybody has been seeing is the judiciary has been under severe attack after the 1st September nullification of the election. And as everybody heard and everybody seen, there was the government went on the extreme onslaught of the judiciary, and we've seen a lot of abuses. We've seen a lot of threats and intimidation of the court, and this came out in play the other day when the court lacked a quorum each to preside over, to hear the petition for stopping the election. And the MP was a bit economical with the truth in the sense that he was saying nothing happened. And in reality, a day to the petition hearing, we had the bodyguard to the deputy chief justice who was shot, and this was a clear threat, a direct threat to the DCJ, and it played out the next day. We couldn't have a complete setup, so I think yeah.
Well, I wanted to ask, I mean, and I'll give Aisha, our political analyst, another take here. I mean, Aisha, there was so much enthusiasm and praise for Kenya's democracy when the Supreme Court overturned August presidential election result. I mean, did it serve for nothing if Kenya can't effectively hold a free and fair election that both sides accept?
Yes, I think it's going to affect not only perceptions of Kenya as a mature polity, a relatively mature polity in East Africa, but also it's going to affect business with Kenya. And of course, most tragically, it's going to affect ordinary Kenyans on the street, many of whom still live in dire economic situations, many of whom are divided along political and tribal lines, unfortunately. We saw that this kind of spillover from the political into the communal happened post the 2007 elections in Kenya. It was to be hoped that this could be avoided, particularly given that Kenya is one of the countries in the world that spends the most per capita on elections. So, you know, given that it spends a large amount of money on elections, one was hoping that this rerun election would be free and fair, would be actually held along the lines that are internationally accepted around the world. However, because many of the inconsistencies, if you will, that were found with the August poll were not rectified. The issues within the IEBC were not rectified. That is why Mr. Odinga pulled out, and I would say legitimately so. So the perceptions of Kenya, both as a polity and its relations, its economic and political relations with the rest of the world, are going to suffer. And indeed, as I said, ordinary Kenyans on the ground are already suffering as a result.
Okay, Kimani, let me put this to you. In seeing that the body in charge of overseeing the election in the first round was basically deemed corrupt by the Supreme Court, which overturned their judgment, it still hasn't seen serious reform. And in this rerun election, we're getting numbers of around about 35% of registered voters actually taking part in Thursday's election. No ballots were cast in more than 20 constituencies. Can Uhuru Kenyatta have actual legitimacy if he continues to rule as president?
As I pointed out earlier, legitimacy stems from the constitutionality of the elections, and the elections were done in line with the Constitution and as ruled by the Supreme Court in their September 1st judgment that elections were to be held within 60 days. IEBC was a respondent in that petition, and they were ordered by the Supreme Court to conduct that election. It is instructive to also note that IEBC or any of its officials were not found culpable by the Supreme Court of any criminality or any illegality, none of the officers. And therefore, the demands by Mr. Odinga and his NASA coalition for us to act outside of the Constitution and outside of our laws, to eject from office electoral commissioners, electoral officials, to eject from office service providers who are providing the IT system, those who are to print ballot boxes. These are some of the impractical demands that Mr. Odinga was making on the Electoral Commission to derail the holding of an election. It is my assertion that Mr. Odinga and the NASA coalition were never interested in an election. Remember, before the August 8th election, they had filed over 100 cases before the courts, all designed to derail and sabotage the elections from happening. It therefore became impossible for them to go into a new election knowing the numbers would not in any way favor them. They were bound to suffer a humiliating defeat, and therefore went overdrive to try and sabotage that election from happening. Now the election has happened. What Mr. Odinga has done, he has transformed his political party from being what he called the National Super Alliance to what he has now called the National Resistance Militia. This militia is the militia that was in charge of making sure that a certain 9% of this country, 4 counties of what is Mr. Odinga's strongholds, did not turn out to vote. They also went out to intimidate using violence people in Nairobi and other areas not to turn out and vote. Therefore, Mr. Odinga and his militia cannot claim illegitimacy on the basis that people were not able to turn out and vote.
Okay, I will need to let Dennis respond. We're running quickly out of time. Dennis, go ahead.
First of all, I think the MP once again is pushing a line narrative, a very poor crafted narrative, in the sense that just because the resistance movement that Odinga formed it for one purpose, he was saying that the system is installing anarchy. It is a movement to fight back against dictatorship that is now being installed again. So by profiling Odinga's supporters, calling them militia, it is a script that is now being advanced by the government to justify the police brutality that is going down in the Odinga's support base. And according to what he was talking about IBC, the commissioner who had resigned raised very serious issues as far as the credibility of the process is concerned, and also the chairman himself raised an issue. Mr. Kimani also said that the IBC officials were never intimidated. It's true. Everybody knows that we had the ICT manager who was murdered, and even the IBC commissioner Kombe herself also raised the same issues, and the same case was to the chairman and others. So it is very unfair for him to say.
Dennis Owino, I'm sorry, we're actually going to have to leave it there. We are completely out of time for this edition. I'd like to thank you all, three of you, so much for joining us there. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Kuwait warns the Qatar crisis could spell the end of the Gulf Cooperation Council. Is the GCC on the verge of collapse? And is Indonesia facing a test of religious tolerance? Jakarta bans groups that don't follow the country's ideology. The crisis in the Gulf Cooperation Council is nearing the 5-month mark, and Doha's rift with most all the GCC member states doesn't seem any closer to being resolved. In fact, some are now warning if a solution isn't found soon, the consequences could be catastrophic. Bahrain has called for a freeze of Qatar's GCC membership and says it won't attend the next summit if Qatar is there. And Kuwait's emir, who's been trying to mediate the crisis, says we might soon see the collapse of the entire council. So what would that mean for the region? Randolph Nogel reports.
A rift in the GCC is deepening. Some fear pushing a 36-year alliance to the brink of dissolution. The Emir of Kuwait, Sheikh Sabah, said as much when he warned last week of the risks of escalation, including military intervention. Kuwait has played mediator in the diplomatic crisis surrounding Qatar and its Gulf neighbors, but to little effect. Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Egypt have cut diplomatic ties with Qatar, accusing it of funding terrorism, cozying up to Iran, and meddling in the internal affairs of other countries. They've enforced a punitive boycott, blocking their land, air, and sea routes to Qatar, saying the blockade would only be lifted if Qatar met a list of 13 demands, which includes closing Al Jazeera and cutting all ties with Iran. But nearly 5 months on, Qatar isn't bending. And with a GCC summit coming up next month, its membership and the solidarity of the bloc in general hangs in the balance.
Now Qatar is saying it feels sympathetic towards Iran and Saudi Arabia. We do not want anybody to sympathize with us for anything. We are capable, with God's will and strength, to face all those who attempt to interfere with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. So congratulations on Iran, and soon, God willing, you will regret it.
Even though it's been more than 100 days, they failed to present any convincing evidence on what they claim. Any convincing evidence which exists proving that Qatar supports and funds terrorism.
Qatar has long been perceived by Saudi Arabia to be punching above its geopolitical weight. Revenue from Qatar's major natural gas reserves have helped it pursue an independent economic and political agenda. While Saudi Arabia is a major exporter of oil, not natural gas, meaning it can't outsupply or undersell Qatar to apply economic pressure for political purposes. Qatar's support of the Muslim Brotherhood, a group which was instrumental in the toppling of autocrats during the Arab Spring, has undoubtedly been a bone of contention. Saudi Arabia faces its own internal pressures. A burgeoning young population, many who rely on a diminished public sector reeling from record-low oil prices. Emboldened by new U.S. leadership in the Trump administration and its hawkish position on Iran, Riyadh may be trying to reset the regional political landscape. But some are concerned that if the GCC standoff intensifies, it could imperil the future of an alliance which works to foster security in a region that has far too little. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Paris is Salman Al-Ansari. He's the founder and president of the Saudi American Public Relations Affairs Committee. From Doha, we have Sultan Barakat. He's the founding director of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies. And rounding up our panel from Washington, D.C., we have Jim Phillips. He is a senior research fellow for Middle Eastern Affairs at the Heritage Foundation. Thanks all so much for joining us. I'd first like to hear from each of you on where you think this crisis stands. In every dispute, something eventually has to give. What will it be? Salman, let me start with you.
Thank you, Andrea, for having me, and hi to all the viewers of TRT World around the globe. I think we should not call the crisis Gulf crisis. It should be called like the Qatari crisis because it's something that has been inflicted by Doha, and we need to basically have zero tolerance to all advocates and promoters of terrorism, specifically the terrorist ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. So I think the steps of the ATQ, the anti-terror quartet, is very crucial and very important to make Qatar to get back to its mind, to get Qatar to be abiding by the international and regional laws that can secure the region. Let me be very frank, Andrea. Right now, we all have seen the kind of impact of this Qatari boycott, the boycott of the ATQ. And we have had some very positive outcomes out of this boycott. One of them is the Qatari government actually signed an MOU with the United States, which is something that the Qataris have refused to do in the past because they want to keep all their anti-terrorism mechanism for themselves. But right now they are more exposed to the world, specifically to the United States, which is a great step. The other thing is that the United Nations have had a lot of people in the sanctioned list. And right now there are a lot of talks about having Qataris to put those people or to arrest those people who are living right now, up till now, in Doha, who are actually put in the sanctions list of the United Nations and also the Treasury Department of the United States, and also by the four countries, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and United Arab Emirates. So I think we have had some very good outcomes out of this boycott. I think we are looking forward to see more outcomes out of this boycott. Qatar needs to get back to its mind. There is no way possible for them to continue sponsoring terrorism and to support the Muslim Brotherhood and to support all those militias like Fajr Libya militia in Libya or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda affiliated group in Syria, or also Al-Houthis, because we all have seen not only the media engine of Al Jazeera and the Qatari propaganda to be supporting Al-Houthis, but also we have seen there were some leaks of intelligence calls between Qataris and Houthis, and it's for the public right now. Everyone can see it. So I think it's the time for Qatar to be responsible. It's the time for Qatar to abide by the international law, specifically after the Riyadh summit, when more than 55 Muslim leaders met with the President of the United States. They've had it very clear, zero tolerance to terrorism. And if you want to join us in this club, you're welcome. If not, you're gonna face the consequences.
Okay, Sultan Barakat, so it's all on Qatar, according to Salman. And it seems, according to him, that Qatar is starting to understand what it needs to do. Is that your take as well?
I should start by saying that I'm not really here to defend the Qatari position on this. I see myself as an independent academic who hopefully will give you an objective analysis. And this is why, listening to my friend Ansari, I feel very disturbed that we start mixing definitions and policies and actions all together with the main objective of presenting Qatar as the ugly person here. Few of the points Ansari made, we need to stop at those issues and maybe look at them slightly more carefully. You cannot in any way equate Muslim Brotherhood with terrorism, full stop. And anyone who does this, I think, is making a big mistake. What's going on in Egypt is not terrorism versus the state. There are people versus the state. There are various understandings of Muslim or political Islam. There's a whole range of it. So I think in order to resolve this, we should first agree on the definition of what do we mean by terrorism. Next, when we talk about al-Nusra, we talk about the extremist groups in Syria. All were guilty at the beginning of the war in supporting those who were seen as opposing Assad. Turkey did, Qatar did, Saudi Arabia did, the United States did, Britain did, a lot of other groups supported everyone and anyone who was able to take up arms against Assad. Now, as the war developed, some of those groups developed extreme positions and associated themselves with international terrorist organizations and so on. And I think Qatar was one of those countries that had withdrawn and changed its perception, its position in relation to supporting those groups very early on in the conflict. And the third point he's made in relation to Qatar signing the MOU with the United States. Qatar may have signed it a bit late, but at least it signed it. Other countries who are blockading Qatar has not signed the same arrangement with the United States and do not have the same arrangements with the United States. So I think we have to be really very objective when we look at this, because as far as I see it, and I'm not a national of the Gulf, it is harming the Gulf as a whole. And it's not just affecting Qatar. This exercise that's going on for more than 6 months now has ridiculed the whole Gulf nations, the 6 of them put together in front of the international community. And I think they really need to get their act together, and they need to take very careful look at what is being said and how it's being presented, so that the benefit is there for all the Gulf people. We have 50 million people living within the GCC, or 50, maybe 55 by now.
Okay.
And I don't think they deserve what's going on at the moment.
Okay, Salman, I'll get your response in a minute, but first I want to turn it over to Jim Phillips, and just, Jim, get your assessment of where you think this crisis really stands, what will have to give to find a resolution here, if that's even possible at this point.
Well, I think from the point of view of Washington, this crisis comes at a very bad time. ISIS has not even been defeated yet totally, but the coalition appears to be splintering in some ways with the fighting and friction between the Kurdistan regional government and the government in Baghdad. And now with this Qatar crisis, there are reports that President Trump himself may become involved in trying to broker some kind of a face-saving solution for both sides in this conflict. The leader of Qatar reported that the president invited him to go to Camp David at some point for these talks, although the talks officially have not been announced. It remains to be seen whether that actually will happen, but from the Trump administration's point of view, there is some desire to see Qatar improve its efforts to fight terrorism, especially in the financial side and the ideological side, but there is also an urge to repair the damage to the relations between the these former allies and get them focused on the threat from ISIS and the threat from Iran, which in the long run is even greater than the Islamic State or ISIS.
Can you give me a more specific answer here in where you think Qatar could bend in satisfying the demands of the other GCC members that want it to change its stance on various issues as they've listed?
Well, I think Qatar could consider compromises on several different issues. From Washington perspective, financial, cracking down on the financial support of terrorism would be probably at the top of that list. But Al Jazeera is widely known to present distorted news. It did that with loops of news footage in the war against Iraq that it used to discredit the U.S. It also has presented distorted news on other fronts, and that may be something that Qatar could consider correcting.
Okay, Jim, just let me clarify. When you say that Qatar could bend on its financing of terrorist organizations, do you include then the Muslim Brotherhood, which is the primary target there, as a terrorist organization?
I think the Brotherhood is, I would classify it as a starter drug that many of its members go on to use the same ideology to justify terrorism. But I think from the standpoint of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, the Brotherhood is a threat to their internal stability, and from their point of view, could be considered a terrorism group.
Okay. Jim, let me turn it over to Salman al-Ansari now, and I want you to respond to something Sultan Barakat was saying, and where you think this does leave the Gulf and how it affects its lack of unity and the wider region in that sense, as well as the perception internationally of the Gulf states being so disunified.
I think just going back to Mr. Barakat's point about Syria and about how Qatar has been actually involved in supporting Jabhat al-Nusra. He actually admitted the fact that Qatar was involved in supporting Jabhat al-Nusra, which is affiliated to Al-Qaeda. But the only difference he mentioned was the fact that he tried to say that all the other countries like Saudi and others were in the same camp of supporting it, which is not true and has no facts at all. There's no fact or evidence about that, but there are all facts that pointing at Qatar with that regard. This is number one. Number two, when it comes to the political dynamics in the region and how we should all be united to confront Iran, let me be very frank. We cannot confront Iran without confronting the groups that support the bigger plan of Iran. And the groups that support the bigger plan of Iran is basically the Muslim Brotherhood. Why I'm saying so? Because Iran cannot operate in any country without having some sort of a turmoil, some sort of an issue within the countries, without having some states within states. And the Muslim Brotherhood has been, in that regard, very effective in creating states within states, which is something cannot be tolerated by all the countries in the regions. If Qatar wants to pursue its support of the Muslim Brotherhood, let's be very frank. Like, I know that there are some people who would say the Muslim Brotherhood is not a terrorist organization and you should not label it, etc. But let's be very frank. What about having the godfather of the Muslim Brotherhood, who's residing in Doha right now, who is considered to be the Mufti of Qatar, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who kept being justifying any terrorist action against Egypt, including the bombing of some churches within Egypt. So having those people, having this ideology is very, very dangerous, and we need to confront it with force, and we need to confront it with zero tolerance.
Salman, I need to cut you off there. We just need to say goodbye to Jim Phillips, who was joining us there from Washington, D.C. Jim, unfortunately, our satellite time is finished, but thank you so much for your insight. And I'd like to turn it back to Sultan Barakat.
Thank you.
And I would also like to turn our discussion back to the most current issue in this crisis, in that will it put an end to the GCC, and how important is that for Qatar, the other GCC members, the region, and the world?
There is a real risk that it could put in an end to the GCC. And I think that would be extremely sad and would be a huge waste of 36 years of investment. The GCC until today, or until June, or 5th of June, has been the most effective multinational organization that we've known in the Arab world for a long time. And I think its integrity is very important for the stability of the Gulf, for the prosperity of the Gulf population, and more so to be able to stand up to the threat of Iran. If the GCC is dismantled or weakened, I think everyone is going to lose in this issue.
What's been made of the demand to shut down the Al Jazeera network? Being in Doha, you've seen what Al Jazeera network broadcasts. It's a very influential media organization in various languages. Do you think it's fair, Sultan, that they would demand that media organization be shut down because of what they feel are its skewed and manipulative reports?
Well, the demand is not just to shut down Al Jazeera. They wanted to shut down a number of media outlets that are either fully or partially or invested in by Qatar, partially supported or invested in by Qatar. And that does tell you that the issue is really about freedom of speech. The blockading countries do not wish to have any space where people can express their opinions freely, or their resentment to the way they're ruled, or whatever. And you could see this, and you can understand it from their position, because their populations are not used to this. They have had exactly the same opportunity as Qatar to invest in free media, and they decided not to do. They put their money in media like the NBC, making films, music, etc. A lot of it backfired because it was very much against the core cultural value of their own population. It may have made money in the short term. It has some returns in terms of mobilizing the young people and so on. But culturally, it was a bad investment. Now, Qatar went for news, and they invested in Al Jazeera. And in fact, it's always good to remember that Al Jazeera originally was a Saudi-British project, wasn't a Qatari BBC project. And then it became a Qatari BBC when the Saudi failed to honor its commitment to freedom of expression. Now, these are historical facts that we must consider whenever we talk about Al Jazeera. And I must say also, I mean, watching what happened with Al Jazeera over the years and so on, Al Jazeera did maybe go a little bit off tangent during the Arab Spring. And I think very few people will try and defend the Arabic Al Jazeera during the Arab Spring as such.
Okay. Salman, I'm sorry we lost you there earlier, but I want to get your take, particularly on the very heart of this discussion and what now happens to the GCC. Is it in danger of falling apart, and how profoundly will that affect the Middle East and the Gulf itself?
Okay, great. I think, as we all know, that the GCC has actually established in the early 80s for the main reason of combating the dangers, or to confront the dangers that are within the Middle East, specifically the radical Iranian regime. And this is number one. Number two, if we have one of the GCC members to be acting against the will of the other GCC nations, against the security of the other GCC nations. So I think in order to make the GCC stronger, we actually need to put that member accountable. And that's what's exactly happening. And we need to refer back to what Adel Jubeir, the Foreign Affairs Minister of Saudi Arabia, has said. He said it very clearly, that the Qatari issue is very, very small. So we should not give it like more of like a momentum, as if Qatar is having this kind of influence to make the whole GCC to collapse, or any of those big claims. So I think we will keep going. The four countries will keep going forward, and will try to identify any risk here and there, and we'll deal with it. This is number one. Number two, with regard to what Mr. Barakat has said about Al Jazeera channel, let me be very frank. Al Jazeera channel has been hosting people from ISIS, members of ISIS, in Doha, and they are all on the record, all on YouTube. Anyone can watch, and having people who praise Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS. Is that something to be freedom of expression, or more of a marketing tool to market for those militant, despicable groups? This is not acceptable at all. So if anyone wants to talk about Al Jazeera, they should not mix it up with the idea of freedom of expression. It's all agenda-driven to promote hatred and to promote intolerance in the Arab world, which is something that cannot be accepted at all.
Salman, we need to go, but Sultan, I'll let you quickly respond to that in the last 30 seconds.
I'm not aware of them hosting ISIS members, but we all remember the days when they were a real irritant to the United States in Afghanistan and Iraq. And the reason for that was that they were able to access those sites under the bombardment of the Americans, and were broadcasting for the rest of the world, and particularly for the Arab world, what was going on. We remember the coverage of Al Jazeera in Gaza, in South Lebanon, etc., etc. So I don't think that it is fair, really, to say that Al Jazeera is behind the ills in the Arab society. Al Jazeera transmits what's going on in the Arab society and does not make the news. We should focus on how we should adjust our own policies, our own politics, to ensure that we avoid going into those difficult situations. And I feel for Saudi Arabia as it goes through the change in its leadership. I also feel the same pressure the United Arab Emirates suffers from the Muslim Brotherhood. They have their own indigenous movement of Muslim Brotherhood, and they feel the threat, as does Egypt. But that doesn't mean that we should close our eyes and pretend we don't hear, we don't see, and things will resolve themselves. We know from history that it won't. There will be uprising again and again, and stability will be a real far objective to all.
Sultan Barakat, I will have to give you the last word. Thank you so much for joining us, as well as Salman Al-Ansari on the Newsmakers.
We need to clamp down on ideological infiltration, such as extremism, radicalism, terrorism, marring the joints of our nation. There is now a wall holding us back from drawing a line as we're committing to the Pancasila, the 1945 Constitution, the Republic of Indonesia, and unity in diversity.
The Indonesian parliament has approved a presidential decree to ban civil organizations deemed against the country's ideology. Known as Pancasila, the theory is based on 5 principles, including national unity, social justice, and a belief in God. But the decree has been heavily criticized. Some argue it limits free speech and allows authorities to silence dissent. Meanwhile, President Joko Widodo has appointed a special envoy to promote religious harmony at a time when critics say Indonesia's diversity and religious tolerance are under threat. Well, to help us understand all of this, we are joined now from Jakarta by Tobias Basuki. He's a researcher at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Thanks so much for joining us, Tobias. Tell us, is religious tolerance in Indonesia under threat, or is it being protected?
Overall, in general, religious tolerance and relations between religious communities had been somewhat under threat in the past so-called 10-15 years. But in regards to this particular presidential instruction that's recently made into law, I believe it's a different arena altogether. It's more of a one thing, the government policy. It's more actually a political action in regards to directly looking ahead against political oppositions for the 2019 presidential election that will come in 2 years.
Okay, so can you clarify that there is no interest, or in fact disinterest really, in actually protecting Indonesia's secular state?
Yes, to some extent it is almost an undemocratic way to protect so-called Indonesia's secular position by, in this case, disbanding the Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. But of course, critics both from the religious groups and also at the same time from freedom and democracy activists has criticized the government for using that law. But that being said, of course, it's in principle a hit on a democratic principle, but this is not something that's completely new. This actually, the previous law on civil society organization had existed in Indonesia since 1985, and it has just been revised to actually particularly undermine Hizbut Tahrir Indonesia. So this is what is going on, and in effect, this is actually a government move because most of the opposition towards the current government usually comes from the more religious right groups, including Hizbut Tahrir, that often uses religious ideas to religious narratives to actually challenge the current government. So the disbanding of Hizbut Tahrir by using this presidential instruction is essentially actually rather a limited political attack against this particular group. But of course, in principle, it may have potential longer consequences.
And I mean, tell us about those consequences. Where does this leave the political opposition? Where does it leave religious minorities? Should they have something to genuinely fear?
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily. I believe in regards to religious minorities, at this point, at the present government, it is often considered a pluralist coalition, which often is accused actually of not accommodating to the more ultra-conservative religious groups. So this is what's going on. But the problem with the extension of this civil society organization law, which in return was actually re-strengthened by the president's instruction to ban an organization that is deemed anti-Pancasila, which is the nation's ideology, is feared to be almost a gray principle, which you can name anything to be anti-Pancasila. But in action, it is not actually that problematic yet under this administration, because even the banning of Hizbut Tahrir really took a lot of concession and compromise between various groups, and it has been agreed by the two largest Indonesian Muslim organizations. Hence, it's not that easy to just ban any organization just for the sake of being anti-Pancasila or against the government.
Okay. We just saw some pictures on our screen, actually, of Basuki Purnama, or Ahok, a Christian who'd run for governor, a popular politician. He was convicted of blasphemy on what some call very flimsy charges. Government critics say it is a clear example of a crackdown on anything that is not Islamic and threatening the current government. Is that how you see it as well, or was his case more specific than that?
Yes, his case is actually more specific. So what is currently happening between the recent imprisonment of the previous Jakarta governor and heading towards the 2019 election is the coalition of the government, which is consisting of new politicians, more on a nationalist line of groupings, against actually what is going on from the opposition, which is more of ultra-conservative religious right from the opposition. Although the leaders of the opposition are not necessarily religious leaders themselves, but there's often religious pretext. So that is the contention that is ongoing currently in Indonesia. And the presidential instruction on disbanding Hizbut Tahrir was often criticized by the opposition in Indonesia to be a reaction because there's so much pressure from the religious groups against the previous governor, Ahok, to be imprisoned. And hence, he is actually preparing himself to actually attack these opposition because they attack these nationalist politicians.
Okay. Now, regardless of any laws they put in place, there really is an atmosphere of intolerance and the persecution, really, of religious minorities. There's a perception from the outside that that's what's going on. Indonesia's actually even seen the rise of gated communities for Muslims only. Tell us how that atmosphere, that perception can and should be addressed.
And that's where it gets very complicated because overall, I think the religiosity in Indonesia started to increase after the breakdown of the authoritarian regime in '98. But the problem was what this religiosity is translated as has never been translated well by either the government or by the major religious groups. And currently, in the very highly contested political contestations, it's actually often either radical and ultra religious groups that are defining it in very narrow and strict terms, and also politicians for political benefits. And hence, that's why the religiosity has been translated into a very narrow and restrictive, that is in opposition towards Indonesia's multiculturalism. That's why we've been seeing a lot of attacks against the Ahmadiyya community, which had never been a problem in the past 30, 40 years, and also against the Shiite groups and also other minority religious groups like the Christians. So that has been on the rise because that religiosity, which initially was actually a neutral thing, was translated into a political narrative to actually attack opposition, whether be it in the regions or at the national level.
Okay. Tobias Basuki, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us from Jakarta.
Sure.
That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. You can check out our other debates on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Australia shuts down its controversial detention center on Manus Island after a string of alleged human rights abuses. What happens to the hundreds of asylum seekers still living there? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.